Thank you very much, and good evening to everybody. Let's see, I need to advance my slides here. Here we go. There are two general approaches for dealing with the climate change problem: mitigation and adaptation. Effective mitigation requires the rapid reduction of the emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. On the other hand, adaptation involves anticipating the climate changes that are coming at us as best we can and taking steps to minimize the impacts of those climate changes. In collaboration with Selkirk's Innovates, we are developing a novel approach for dealing with climate change adaptation. We feel that this should add detail to our understanding of the climate changes we'll be facing in the future. When we look at the global mitigation efforts, we haven't been doing very well at all in the last few decades. But there has been some optimism recently because it looks like the global emissions curve has started to at least bend in the right direction. But this is really insufficient. It should be heading down rapidly. And if instead we look at another metric, which is the Earth's energy imbalance, which is measured by satellites, and it's about the best metric we have for the state of global warming on the planet, this has been increasing at an increasing rate since 2000, and it continues to go in the wrong direction. Despite the best efforts of the Kyoto Protocol, the Copenhagen Accord, the Paris Climate Agreement, 24 COP meetings, and countless warnings from the scientific community. Until we start to bend this curve in the right direction, we should be considering the worst case scenarios, and we're going to have to depend on adaptation measures in the future. And for those adaptation measures to be effective, we have to have a solid understanding of the magnitude and the details of the climate changes that are coming at us. Okay, so the approach that we're working on involves quantifying the probabilities of exceeding specific climate thresholds that are critical for both built and natural systems. And we feel this information should be of most use for planners, for asset managers, for city planners, and for engineers who are working with infrastructure. So why the focus on thresholds? Here's an example of some infrastructure that had a catastrophic failure due to exceeding a high temperature threshold. Now, the consequences of this catastrophic failure are very low. However, here's another example. And in this case, this high temperature failure, if a passenger train at high speed hit this, it would be a very high consequence failure. There's many assets that are vulnerable to both temperature and precipitation thresholds, and bridges are among them. And when bridges fail, they tend to be costly and sometimes catastrophic. A recent article in The New Scientist estimates that 1 in 4 steel bridges in the US are prone to failure before 2040 due to climate problems. And bridge decks or bridges have usually a pretty standard way of dealing with temperature changes. The bridges have segments on the bridge decks, and they have gaps between the segments. Those are the expansion joints. And this allows the individual segments of the bridge to expand and contract with temperature change. When you reach the temperature threshold and they've expanded all the way and there's no more room for them to expand, then pressure builds up in the bridge and the bridges can fail catastrophically like this. Now, it would be advantageous for planners to be able to anticipate when this climate threshold might be reached so you can get out in front of the problem and modify the bridge expansion joints so they can accommodate a higher temperature, and you don't end up with a costly failure like this. Okay, so the example I'm going to use uses information from Nelson, BC. The index that we're looking at is the highest annual maximum temperature, or essentially the hottest day of the year. The red curve shows projections for this index into the future following a high carbon future, or sort of the worst case scenario. And the green curve at the bottom shows projections for this index into the future following a more optimistic carbon pathway. And the reality is probably we'll end up somewhere between these two outcomes. Here's the observed hottest day of the year record from Nelson. And you can see in 2021, in June, we set the all-time record at 40.7 degrees in Nelson. The climate threshold I'm choosing for the first example is 41.5 degrees Celsius. And the reason for this is it's approximately the 1 in 100 year event based on the observed climate data from Nelson. We've never reached this threshold. We've come within 0.8 degrees Celsius of it, but you can tell just intuitively by looking at this graph that as we go forward in time, the probability of reaching this threshold is going to go up. And it's because the projections essentially rise up into this threshold. So there's a couple of ways of quantifying the probability or calculating these probabilities. And they're pretty straightforward, and they give us a couple of very valuable tools for planning. The first is the annual exceedance probability. And this shows us the probability of exceeding the 41.5 degree threshold in each year starting now and going through to 2050. Currently, there's about a 1% chance of exceeding this threshold, so it's the 1 in 100 year event. But by the time we get to 2050, there's about a 10% chance of exceeding this threshold, so it's the 1 in 10 year event, and this is due to climate change. And this information is useful for those who are working with systems that resolve on an annual basis. Things like, for example, snow conditions at a ski area, or any climate index that's related to an annual budget. The second probability curve is the cumulative probability curve, and this is a little bit different. This is the probability of exceeding this threshold once within a given time frame, and that time frame can be resolved starting now on the bottom axis and to whatever end time is chosen. So the analogy here is that the annual exceedance probability is like rolling a 6-sided die once each year, and in each year you've got a 1 in 6 chance of getting a 6. The cumulative probability curve is like rolling a 6-sided die once each year for 10 years and then looking at the probability of getting 1/6 in that 10-year period. And of course the probability is much higher. But the cumulative probability curve is of use for people who are dealing with situations where failures are costly or catastrophic, because you're not really interested in the probability of this happening each year. You want to know the probability of this happening once within your planning time frame, because it's a disaster when it happens. Okay, so if we have this information, the planning time frame, 25 years out, we have the threshold, it's 41.5 degrees Celsius, it's the 1 in 100 year event. What is the probability of exceeding this in Nelson in the next 25 years? And you crunch the numbers, and that probability ends up being over 70%. So planners may say, well, we've got a bunch of assets that have the 1 in 100 year temperature design, and if they all failed at the same time, it would be a bad outcome. So our risk tolerance for this is only 20%. So this is where this curve comes in really useful, because what it does is it lets planners know that by 2031, the probability of reaching this threshold will exceed the risk tolerance for the consequences of the threshold being breached. In other words, it's a time marker, it's a flag in time that lets planners know that by 2031, you should take some steps to increase the temperature threshold for these assets. Otherwise, you will end up in a situation where the probability of failure exceeds your risk tolerance for that failure. Okay, so this can be very easily calculated for a bunch of different temperatures. So say we have some other assets in Nelson that are more valuable assets, but they have a higher temperature threshold, 43.5 degrees Celsius. So here's the cumulative probability curve, and you crunch the numbers. And in this case, the probability of exceeding this threshold by 2050 is over 35%. But because they're more valuable assets, the planners may say, well, our risk tolerance for these assets failing is only 10%. And again, the probability curve lets you know that in this case, by 2035, steps should be taken in order to avoid being in a situation where the probability of failure exceeds your risk tolerance for that failure. Okay, and this can be flipped around, and the calculations run the other directions. Planners may say, we want 95% confidence that none of our temperature-sensitive assets in Nelson are going to fail before 2050. What temperature should they have to be able to tolerate so we know that they won't fail in this time frame? So we have the planning time frame, it's 2050, and we have the cumulative probability curve, and we know what the probability is. In this case, it's 5%, which is also 95% of not occurring. What we don't know is the temperature, and the calculation just goes backwards, and the temperature that backs out from this is 46.7 degrees Celsius. So in other words, in Nelson, if you want 95% confidence that your assets will not fail due to high temperature, they should be designed to withstand 46.7 degrees Celsius. That's pretty hot. And we can take this a step further, and we can use this approach for prioritizing adaptation measures for assets. And this is a very simplistic scenario, a hypothetical situation in a fictitious city that has 3 bridges. The bridge on top is a huge bridge that has international trade going across it, so a high cost of failure. The middle bridge connects 2 halves of the city, so it's important. And the bottom bridge is a small bridge going over the river, and there's other routes, so it would be a low cost of failure. Engineers should give us can give us the temperature failure for these 3 bridges. Asset managers can give us an estimate of the cost of failure for the 3 bridges. And we can compute the probability of exceeding the temperature thresholds for these 3 bridges. And once you have this information, it's very straightforward to compute a risk index, which is simply the cost of failure times the probability of failure. And the bridge with the highest number is your number 1 priority. And in that case, it's the bridge at the top that has the highest number, and that's largely reflecting the very high cost of failure. But the bridge that comes in second is the bridge with the lowest cost of failure, but that's because it also has a very high probability of failure. And the bridge in the middle comes in third. So this is a very simplistic example with only 3 bridges, but you can imagine an asset manager with dozens or maybe hundreds of assets in different locations, all with different temperature thresholds, different costs of failure, that this approach would provide a pretty effective way for prioritizing adaptation measures for a large number of assets. And lastly, I'll just consider a real-world example, some work we did for a cross-country ski area in Western Canada a few years ago. And the board of directors were aware of climate change, and they were concerned about their existing location in a valley bottom. They're wondering if it makes sense to start thinking about relocating to a higher elevation location for better snow conditions. So we jumped into the details, and the first thing we determined was that the average maximum temperature for the months of January, February, and March were well correlated with the number of days after January 1st where you had more than 5 centimeters of snow on the ground, or the length of the ski season. So with this index up around 4 degrees Celsius, you had relatively long ski seasons, and with this index around minus 0.5 degrees Celsius, you had relatively short seasons. But we also had groomers logs from the people who were grooming the cross-country trails. And the red dots indicate years where they had lousy snow. The snow was mushy, there was a low snowpack, and they had a very short season. And the green circles indicate years where they had good snow conditions and a long ski season. And although everyone is aware that the climate has been warming and will continue to warm in the future, by this point, there had been more good years than bad years. So the question was, is now the time to start thinking about investing resources in new facilities at a higher elevation, or do we continue to invest assets or resources into the assets that we have at the valley bottom location? So we did a probability analysis. We looked at the probability of having bad years in the future, or the probability of exceeding the 4 degrees Celsius threshold. And we found that by 2050, 1 in 4 years was going to be a bad year, and by the time you got out to 2070, over 40% of the years would be bad years. But we were also able to flip this around, and we looked at the probability of having good years in the future, or the probability of not exceeding the minus 0.5 degrees Celsius threshold. And we found that by 2030, it was only a 12% chance of having a good year. And by the time you get out to 2050, that was less than 7%. So this was very valuable information for the board because it informed their decision-making process on whether or not they should be allocating resources to a higher elevation site with better snow, or to continue investing in the lower elevation sites. Had I been on the board, I would have voted for the higher elevation site. Okay, so to wrap up, the approach that we're working on focuses on quantifying the probabilities of exceeding critical thresholds that are relevant for both built and natural systems. And this also gives planners a way of comparing the probability of exceeding thresholds with their risk tolerance for those thresholds being exceeded. It also provides design threshold information, the temperature and precipitation thresholds that infrastructure and assets can tolerate without failing with a specified level of confidence and within a planning time frame. And lastly, it also provides a convenient way to prioritize adaptation measures for a large number of assets. And to finish up, I'd just like to reiterate that when we're honest with ourselves, our mitigation efforts globally have not been very good. And given the current political climate, I don't think we're going to be making very much progress in the next few years. In fact, we may slip backwards the way things are going. But that's no reason to give up on mitigation efforts. The reduction of emissions into the atmosphere is really the only way out of this problem. But we also have to be clear-eyed about the climate changes that are coming. They're likely to be significant, and the better we understand the magnitude and the details of the changes that are coming at a granular level, the better our adaptation measures are going to work. Thanks for your attention.